Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Kavli Conversation on Science Communication. My name is Dan Fagan. I'm a professor of science journalism here at NYU and the director of the Science Health and Reporting Program and the Science Communication Workshops. We are very grateful to have you joining us in person and also online. We're thrilled to be back at these conversations instead of having to do them entirely virtually, as we've done in the past, the recent past. And speaking of the recent past, today we're going to look back and also look forward at past coverage of COVID and monkeypox and maybe Ebola too, who knows, but also look ahead and see where and how we can do better, both as journalists and also as watchdogs of public officials, and how those public officials can do better too, because God knows there's plenty of room for improvement. I will leave it to our moderator, Robin Lloyd, to formally introduce our guests, but I'll just say we're very grateful to Varma and Katherine Wu for joining us. Thank you so much. And I'm very grateful to the wonderful Robin Lloyd for hosting this Kavli conversation. Robin is a wonderful senior journalist, science writer, senior as in experienced. That's what I mean by senior. She's also the president of the Council for the Advancement of Science Writing and a real leader in our profession. So Robin, thank you, and take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Dan. It's great to be here again. Thank you, everyone, for coming again. Just to continue on what Dan said, I just want to make a couple setup comments, which is just that as world-shattering and deadly as the pandemic has been, it has also been an opportunity for science and health journalism. We've had an opportunity to really show our value to readers and to society during a global crisis. And there's been definitely, notwithstanding our title today, some outstanding, some fantastic, some prize-winning media coverage of the pandemic that not only served readers and answered their immediate questions and their long-term questions, but also gave readers and viewers a better sense of what science journalism can uniquely offer. I think that's something we want to kind of focus on a little bit, is what can we uniquely offer that general assignment reporters might not bring to their coverage of this. The Atlantic, which it turns out both of tonight's guests have written for. Katherine Wu was a staff writer and Dr. Varma as a non-staffer. They have published some of my favorite COVID coverage. I've been monitoring closely for a newsletter I was writing fairly frequently earlier on in the pandemic. It's been a leader, The Atlantic, among a handful of outlets that continue to find fresh angles and engaging ways to address public health questions on COVID. On that beat, it's not an easy thing to do, to find the fresh angles and engaging ways to discuss the pandemic. Especially at this point, we can talk about that. But in general, I don't want to beat on too hard in this introduction, but media coverage of COVID-19 by general assignment and science journalists alike has fallen short, missing nuance, stoking controversy for little public gain, if any, spreading misinformation, we've done that, ignoring and minimizing systemic race bias and other forms of bias in healthcare and society in general, failing to avoid binary he said, she said journalism, missing the global perspective often, misunderstanding the interplay between science and policy making, which is something Dr. Varma has written about a fair amount, and generally losing sight of the needs of readers in a time of chaos and crisis. But I have stats here. I'm not going to read them to you, but basically, right now, as I understand it, COVID remains the third leading cause of death in the United States, and it's either the fourth or the second, depending on how you estimate deaths globally. It's the fourth or second leading cause of death globally. And of course, that is just one very final and really doesn't tell the whole story metric of where we stand today with the pandemic. The chaos and the damage persists at high levels that often go unacknowledged and uncovered. So today I'm hoping we can take a fresh look at all this and discuss solutions to ways that we can do better with the current leading infectious diseases, which are myriad, actually, and do better with the next epidemic or pandemic outbreak that occurs threatening the globe's population. So our guests today are Katherine J. Wu, who's a staff writer at The Atlantic, where she covers science, including COVID and in other infectious diseases and cats, which is great. She's also a Story Collider senior producer and a senior editor at The Open Notebook, great resource for science writers and science journalists. She previously served as a science and health reporter at the New York Times, focused on the COVID-19 pandemic from home, largely, apparently. Not able to go in during that remarkable work nonetheless. Her work also has appeared in Undark, National Geographic, Popular Science, and Scientific American. She won a Science and Society Journalism Award in 2021 from NASW and the Everett Clark Seth Payne Award for Young Science Journalists in 2020. She holds a PhD in microbiology and immunobiology at Harvard University. And wait, don't tell me, apparently, flatteringly, but erroneously once called Katie Wu an epidemiologist. And Jade Varma is an epidemiologist, so there's my transition, and a physician executive with expertise in prevention and control of diseases. He has led epidemic responses, developed global and national policies, and led large-scale programs that have saved hundreds of thousands of lives in China, Southeast Asia, Africa, and the United States. After graduating magna cum laude with highest honors from Harvard, Dr. Varma completed medical school, internal residency in medicine, and chief residency at UC San Diego School of Medicine. From 2000 to 2021, he worked on infectious diseases prevention and control for the US CDC, with postings in Atlanta, Thailand, China, Ethiopia, and New York City. In September of 21, Dr. Varma joined Weill Cornell Medicine's Department of Population Health and Sciences to conduct research, training, and programs on public health preparedness. He has authored more than nearly 150 scientific manuscripts as of when I picked up this biographical sketch, 6 essays, and 1 book. Seems like that 6 has to be an undercount. From April 2020 to April 2021, Dr. Varma served as the chief health advisor to the New York City mayor and appeared daily alongside the mayor and often the health commissioner at their daily press conferences about the pandemic. So, both of you are science communicators who have focused a great deal in your writing, speaking, and other energy on the COVID-19 pandemic and other infectious diseases. Do you agree with our little title tonight? Do you agree that in general the media keeps blowing it or messing up in covering the pandemic or these quite significant infectious disease outbreaks? Goes to both of you, really.
You want to start? I can maybe start from this end. I would say that there's plenty of blowing it to go around. Those of us in public health and epidemiology, elected officials, global entities, everybody has to reflect back on what we've done right and what we haven't done right. I would say there have been exceptional examples of scientific communication, so I wouldn't say broadly media has blown it. The Atlantic, Katie, other people's coverage has been extraordinary of this. I think the challenge is, I operate in a world where I assume lots of people are reading that, but I have to actually talk to an audience that largely has not read any of that or caught that nuance. So I think that's really where the challenge is. And so I think the question becomes, is there a way to get that sort of sophistication and quality of scientific journalism that you see in the Atlantic or the New York Times to the level where most people are actually receiving it?
Sorry. I think I agree that there has been a lot of blowing it, but not universal by any means. I think what is kind of interesting is thinking about the sort of crises that have hit the world, and especially the US in the past couple years, is they open up a lot of opportunity for some of the common errors in reporting to really surface and be amplified, like working with really fast changing evidence, sources saying very different things, data just constantly evolving, and readers wanting of the second information, and just the immense pressure. Like when you have really high stakes and a really tight timeline, it is just very easy for mistakes to happen. And so there is room for a charitable interpretation here, but also knowing that the stakes are so high. There have been some, I think, disappointments in the past couple of years that we can definitely talk about. So, I don't know. I have thought about if I could grade the response so far. It is probably in the C+, B- range, but again, massive population average here.
Yeah, I don't know how you want to, do you want us to just, yeah, I have some thoughts that just came to mind. I would say that one of the errors that strikes me, and this is going to be incredibly self-referential and self-congratulatory, is this notion that, and Katie knows as well, that all doctors somehow have a voice in this, and that they're all equivalent in their experience or practice. And one of the things that really struck me as problematic was the over-reliance in certain media outlets to turn to the same voices without ever asking those people if they had any experience whatsoever in public health practice, and sort of the assumption that just because you trained as a doctor, you actually know certain things. So that's kind of one problem. And then I think the second problem was also, and so that's sort of, I think, a natural error, I'm guessing, in sometimes science journalism. And another, I think, challenge that came up often related to the speed of evidence was, and I would see this when I was literally, I was about to go on a press conference at 10 in the morning, our press office would say, oh, journalists are asking about this preprint that just went up an hour ago. Are you ready to comment on it? And it's just like, normally science is a slow process. You have to read the whole thing, understand, but I would have to have some type of intelligent answer about this by skimming it really quickly. And while you get reasonably good at it, that's not a position you want to be in because you're commenting on things that have high stakes. So.
Yeah, and it's really funny because I remember in the early months of the pandemic, everyone was talking about preprints. Do we trust the evidence coming out here? Does the public know enough about what a preprint is so that we can sort of prepare them for the fact that this is not peer reviewed? What does it mean for something to be peer reviewed? What does it mean for data to be preliminary? And now we've progressed all the way to, I screenshotted this thing that I made in Excel an hour ago. Look at this ELISA I just did. And it's like, well, how am I supposed to run this past someone? I don't know how you did it. I don't know how many mice there were. Was it mice? Was it humans? And it has been a lot. and has this lab ever run this assay before? It has been fascinating to see the evolution of sort of our standards for what we're willing to report on, knowing that people want to see this. And it's not just what journalists are reporting, but social media and the people on social media have been given such big voices that sometimes the threshold for what counts as misinformation, what counts as something that is widely shared and being widely talked about has also really evolved. So the things that I'm paying attention to have also massively changed, and I don't know if it's always for the better in terms of mental health. That was a lot, sorry.
No, I love it. So, sourcing came up, so let's explore that a little bit. From my perspective, I did a little reporting too in the first year, and there were these go-to sources, and I feel like we let ourselves off the hook a little bit in terms of, look, this person gives great sound bites, and they seem really smart, and hey, they are an epidemiologist at a really esteemed institution. And then at some point we started sort of, I think, reflecting on where we were going here and really expecting more of ourselves. How did you transition, Katie, in your reporting? I shouldn't even assume that you made the same mistake I did. How did you develop those sources over time so that you weren't always going to the same people and so that you were maybe asking some of the questions that Dr. Varma was talking about?
Yeah, it's interesting because here I should sort of remind everyone that I had only been reporting for about a year and a half, not even, when the pandemic started. I still feel wildly junior, so it's weird for me to be up here. Let's just get that out of the way now. And so I was still developing my sense of how do I get any sources at all? And it was really interesting. I was very glad to be in a newsroom at the time that, some of this was starting to unfold. I had colleagues to turn to, but in terms of building my own source list, I was seeing the same names over and over and over again. But I guess I was really lucky that I had somewhat recently graduated from a program that was focused on microbiology and infectious disease. And I was unshy about reaching out to past contacts and saying, hey, I am curious who you would talk to or what papers you have read on the subject of virology, who knows about coronaviruses, those types of things. Just knowing that I had this advantage and I really wanted to use it because I wanted to make sure. And then just as I was doing that, I started making a habit of asking every person I talked to, who else do you turn to when you can't answer this question? Or when someone started saying, I don't know, one that was generally a good sign that they were willing to acknowledge the limits of their expertise. So that was someone I was very happy to turn to again and again, rather than someone who would just give an answer to everything just because they felt like they were supposed to. And two, when they said, I don't know, I would ask, well, who might? And that was always a great way. Like, even if they didn't know, that was a way for me to start, I guess, tuning my barometer. Like, if this person's expertise says this, this, and this, what are the things that they don't know? What are the things that they are commenting really well on? And can I start sort of building my own internal brain list of hashtags? This person is especially good to talk to about this, but maybe not this.
Dr. Varma, you have an essay that you wrote actually that has advice to journalists saying, can you elaborate a little bit about that? You said, really journalists should be asking people, do you have public health experience? Did you see a preponderance of sourcing in media stories, maybe just in the first year or throughout up to now, where journalists were relying on people who had great academic credentials and had opinions that bore on the pandemic, but the hands-on experience that clearly you have decades of?
Yeah, well, this is the axe that I've been trying to grind as much as I can, especially since I've left government, is, so the problem is that if the question that you're reporting on is purely one of science, like you're purely reporting a new scientific discovery, then it is absolutely important to go to the subject matter experts at elite universities or expert institutions and ask them for their feedback on it. If the question that you're asking is, how do we turn that knowledge into public policy and practice, that is a completely different discipline and field. But unfortunately, the people who you're going to turn to, who are the knowledge experts, the science experts, are rarely going to say, actually, I've never done that before. Here's a perfect example. And I want to give you an example of that, but then also explain how it creates harms really briefly. So it's very important when you're asking questions about public health policy or practice to ask the person you're asking, have you ever done this before? So when you, and I'll give you an example. Very early on, when those of us, I was here, I came back from Africa to help set up the city's contact tracing and testing programs and stuff. And I would hear academic people talking about contact tracing. And I know those people have literally never done this in their life. They have never run a program for a government where they had to do this. And they would create a perception about how this can and should be done without understanding the real on-the-ground realities. And I worry that in often situations there was an expectation gap that was created by a tendency to lean on experts who have never investigated an outbreak, never run a mass vaccination program, never did testing, never processed public health data, et cetera. So I just think there's a level of nuance that's necessary, and I do think your readers will benefit by having a more diverse set of sources. Now, I'll say one last thing and I'll stop, which is the challenge, of course, is that the people who have the most expertise are the ones who are least available to talk to you, either because they're already in those jobs and or because they work for government and people like me, and we are very restricted in who we can talk to and how much we can say. So I'm not saying I have the absolute answer to it, but this is where the tension lies, I think.
And something that I have really tried to be very humble about is just broadening my definition of what expertise is. I mean, certainly when I started doing this job, it was very automatic for me to think, PhD, MD, like let's find those people with the right degrees who have been at the correct institutions. And I was looking over my sources, just in retrospect on a day that I didn't want to do anything else. And I was noticing that, a lot of my sources tended to come from the same coastal institutions, tended to have the same sorts of degrees. It was not great because few of these people, especially if they had attained leadership positions at hospitals or universities, they were not doing as much of the on-the-ground work. And also, thinking about a huge topic such as long COVID, if it's something incredibly new, it's really important to be talking to patients who are doing some of the data gathering themselves. And certainly, in thinking about like some of the stories that we have done that have a human interest angle, doctors are certainly not the only ones who can comment on how difficult it is to be working at a hospital that is inundated with extremely sick people. What about the respiratory therapists? What about the nurses? What about the physician's assistants? Even the custodial staff who are thinking about how to protect themselves when they are working extreme hours and they are often working in the background unnoticed. Just the sort of questions that have come up for me about like, am I truly getting the full scope of the story if I am turning to the same people with the same, credentials that I maybe have been biased to think about myself, having been through academia in some way.
Yeah, that's a great insight. Thanks. Dr. Varma, can you talk a little bit more about the problem of just following the science? One of the things I liked in your essays was this translation, this context in which decision-making and policy-making must occur, that it's not in this, oh, we're just going to follow the science. That there are systemic constraints. I think a lot of reporters have not been aware of that. And you mentioned the contact tracing, that there was this expectation that, oh, we're going to do contact tracing. It's an essential, the fourth arm of how we're going to squelch this. And some systems were set up, and Apple and Google, all these technology firms tried to get on board, and it was an expectation that got set and then that fell through, and then, failure, how could you let us down? What is wrong with that thinking, and how can journalists not fall in that trap?
Yeah, I think having this is, I think, the value of having a training program specifically in scientific journalism, and then hopefully for some of you who are interested in health and health policy, to think about sort of how, public health policy generally gets made. And the sort of framework that I like to use, and the one I use when I was writing decision memos for the mayor, or when I've done it in other countries and stuff, is to think of it in this structure. So you start with the evidence. So you don't follow the science, but you start with the evidence, and you try to assess the totality of benefits and of harms. So that's a scientific question that you can gain based on evidence. Then you expand that to think about the totality of benefits and harms beyond the scientific evidence. So could there be unintended harms, unintended benefits to implementing something? And then you have to go through feasibility, acceptability, affordability, and then ethics and justice. And so let me just briefly explain what those means. So let's use a vaccine mandate, for example, a requirement that you get vaccinated. Benefits. Okay, well, we have scientific evidence that vaccination protects you somewhat against infection and a lot against severe illness and death, and maybe against other complications like long COVID. So benefits. Harms, extremely rare and uncommon. But a vaccine mandate, benefits, increase the proportion of people in your population vaccinated, reduce the demand on your hospital system. It's a shared public resource. We need to keep that, we need to keep hospital beds open for people who have acute injuries, so it's a shared benefit. Harms, by extending vaccine mandates, do people feel coerced, and therefore do they feel like there are harms associated with them? Feasibility, do I have the ability to actually implement it? Can I require every business to check vaccine status? Affordability, how much is it going to cost me to do this? Because businesses might close or other things. And then the ethics of this. Is this going to actually be beneficial? Is there discrimination against people unvaccinated? Or alternatively, by forcing people to get vaccinated who might not otherwise, or coercing them in some way to get vaccinated, are you actually advancing health justice and equity because you're protecting them? So this is a long range of considerations. And unfortunately, when you talk to a scientist, they're going to really focus on benefits and harms in the narrowest possible way. They're not going to have all those other perspectives. So it's important to think about sources that can help you look at policy translation. And most often, our policies that we implemented were a mishmash of things. And people would say, well, that's not scientific. Well, but if you follow down all the things that you need to do, there are benefits that come out or reasons why you might do something that aren't strictly based entirely on scientific evidence.
Yeah, thanks for that. Let's talk a little before we go. We have a little time. So I just want to make sure we mention some of the infectious disease outbreaks that have now entered our discourse in the United States media. We've had the monkeypox issue came up, especially in the summer. We had an outbreak in the United States. And there was, in New York State in particular, the incidence of polio. There was one case of paralytic polio, and then detection of poliovirus components in wastewater in several counties in lower New York State. So I guess one question there is, Dr. Varma, you talked about the fact that monkeypox is totally different. We have a test, we have drugs, we have vaccines, was one of your lines in one of your essays. Is there a lesson to take here on how the media should be covering this virus differently from the coronavirus? There are some things that are common across how we cover infectious diseases, but this one, really it had its own lessons, I should think.
Yeah, I was more frustrated when it related to monkeypox to the federal government response than I was necessarily to media coverage around it. I do think there was probably a unnecessary focus in a lot of the media coverage, either on this is another pandemic of the magnitude of COVID-19. Yes, it's a pandemic by the definition of an infectious disease that's spread and infecting populations around the world, that has implications for travel, trade, tourism, other things. It's a public health emergency, all of those things. but, sort of having the coverage be a little less breathless, about that the sky was going to fall. I mean, that's one concern. And the second concern was the sort of challenge over trying to define, is this a sexually transmitted infection or not? And this became something that really bothered me a lot, because it became very clear early on that this was being transmitted, that one of the major ways in which transmission was occurring was through sex. Whether that means skin-to-skin contact or exposure to mucosal fluids or bodily fluids or anything, we didn't know for sure. We still don't know 100%. But it became very, very difficult. I think the media got stuck in a debate that was real, but it was hard to figure out where the balance lies about at what point do you really identify this and say for what it is, and also focus on the populations that are highest risk without creating stigmatizing coverage. So I don't blame the media entirely for that, because I think scientists and experts in this were battling, but at the same time it was a challenge, I think. Okay.
Katie, you did write a little bit about monkeypox. How did you take any lessons from covering COVID and apply them in the coverage that you did with monkeypox?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I immediately thought of when I think monkeypox stories started to break was, well, we know that there has been a huge equity problem with COVID. This is going to be amplified in certain ways with monkeypox, especially given the sexual networks in which it was spreading and has continued to spread, primarily in men who have sex with men. How do we cover this responsibly? How do we turn to the correct experts? And it felt even more important to me to not just talk to physicians, virologists, epidemiologists, but people actually being impacted by the response or lack thereof in some cases. And so I felt like I was able to maybe hit the ground running slightly more than I had with COVID, but it was also an entirely new disease. I felt like I had to build my source list up from scratch again, which was also important to do. I wasn't going to be calling the same people. Very few people specialize in both. These are incredibly different viruses with incredibly different histories. Just the ways that they had to be handled were going to be so different. And because people were automatically drawing comparisons between COVID and monkeypox, sometimes responsibly, sometimes not, I felt the need to acknowledge that those things were happening and like also explain to readers like, well, we actually do need to uncover the nuances here and have these conversations. I actually remember writing just a little bit in one piece about, this conversation about, is this an STI or not? I think I tried to communicate like, sure, it's important to talk about transmission, but we also can't let a discussion like this distract from the larger issues at hand. I had one really fantastic source tell me that like, we can call it whatever we want, but if that is just obscuring the fact that there is a lackluster response and that people are being stigmatized and they feel like that their health is not being prioritized, it hardly matters what we call it. So yeah, that was a bit of a ramble, but I hope that was useful.
I can ask you a question for you? Because I think you have a unique perspective, but I'd be curious if you could reflect maybe on some of your colleagues. Because your perspective is different, obviously, because you're like uniquely, you're a subject matter almost expert himself. You have a PhD in microbiology from Lloyd institution. But so many reporters seem to get all of their sources, I think, off of Twitter. And this, during monkeypox, was a real problem. Some of these same COVID, let's call them maximizers. All that I want to say. I think we're underestimating how bad COVID is, generally. So let's say some of the people that were really getting fame off of like saying the sky's falling during COVID suddenly switched to this other disease, and it was really nerve-wracking to me because I was like, oh God, I please hope that journalists don't turn to these people. And actually, they asked them these questions. Have you ever worked on sexually transmitted infections? Have you ever worked on this disease? So I'd be curious. Do you have any thoughts on some of your colleagues? I know this is not something that you do because you have that unique perspective, but most of your colleagues don't.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is necessarily about me. I don't know. I think this is where imposter syndrome comes in handy sometimes. But no, it is a really interesting question, and I have struggled with this a little bit myself. Like knowing if I am starting from a blank slate with sourcing, where do I start? A lot of times, like I would start on a new topic, and like my academic instincts would kick in. I would go to PubMed, and I would like type in the correct terms, and I would click review, and like who has written a recent review on this? With something like monkeypox, it was interesting because a lot of the most cited literature was from years ago, and it was difficult. But what was interesting was I think I had learned over the course of COVID there are people who have a lot of followers, get a lot of retweets, say compelling and memorable things about infectious diseases, but I had made my list of people to avoid, and I had also started to cultivate a list of experts that I could trust, not just for direct scientific information, but also to recommend other sources. Like virologists know other virologists, even if they're not specializing in the same thing, but they will say, here is someone who has done so much work on pox viruses. I remember seeing them at a conference 2 years ago, and they gave the most killer talk on like whatever. And that was incredibly useful. Like I did that multiple times at the very beginning. And I knew that there were people who were not only willing to like celebrate their colleagues for that, but also say, hey, I don't know, but I know this person will know. And those networks just became so useful. Yeah.
Oh, that was great, both of you, thanks. I just have one interjection, and then I'll go to Dan Fagan with a question. And that interjection is, please don't turn to Twitter as your primary source of finding scientists and public health researchers and people with experience launching campaigns. Please do not make that your number one. I think with myself, I'll just speak personally, that's my last resort. So it's there, yay, but I really do try to avoid that.
It's not I mean, to be fair, it's not the worst place. I don't think it's
I agree.
one, but it's not bottom of the barrel. I don't think it's my last resort, actually. And, you know, I think if you feel comfortable enough in a general area that you feel like you can vet the recommendations you get, feel free to go on Twitter and say, hey, can anyone recommend an expert in this? And make sure you say they don't have to be on Twitter, because then you are really sub-selecting for people who have decided to go on Twitter. But, you know, if you really are feeling tapped out in terms of your network, it's not a bad place to go. And I think if I am really diving into something that I've never reported on before, I have actually searched on Twitter, like if someone has in their bio that they are, I don't know, an expert in polioviruses, like I will double check, certainly, but hey, it's not a bad place to go.
Fair. Okay. Dan Fagan.
Just a quick interjection on Twitter. To me, the issue is not using Twitter or not using Twitter. The real problem is relying on Twitter metrics to decide who to talk to. That's, in fact, I would do the opposite. I would be highly suspicious of anyone who is a raging success on Twitter. But Twitter is, to me, is still a perfectly fine way if you're judicious about it and willing to put in the time. It's a useful tool for finding people, including people who are not widely quoted or followed. So I thought I would take the privilege of the first question, but it's not really a question from me. It's from somebody who's watching online and has asked me to get Jay and Katie to talk a little bit about our woeful predictive capacity, and especially in light of the fact that we had and still have, or actually in one case had, programs that were specifically designed to be sort of early warning systems. Programs like PREDICT, the EcoHealth Alliance, they were aimed specifically at exactly the kind of species jumping virus that COVID-19 turned out to be. We seem to continue to be really bad, maybe worse than ever, at figuring out when, where, and how severely these diseases are going to emerge. And so the question, I guess, is it just too difficult a problem, or are we screwing this up? Have we spent all this money in places that we shouldn't have spent it, and what should we have done instead?
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts on this, so I'll try to keep myself short, because for background, let's talk about COVID. I spent 3 years embedded with China CDC from 2008 to 2011. What was I doing there? I was part of a small group of people chosen by CDC and approved by the Chinese government after the first SARS outbreak to be embedded there and to help them detect new emerging infections. I was running something called the Emerging Infections Program. Where were we focused? We were focused, most of our money that I was putting in was focused on trying to detect new respiratory infections. Where was our focus site? Hubei province, central China. So the answer, which is where Wuhan is, just for people who don't know China. So to give people context, we, as in people who work in international and global public health, have a reasonably good idea of where the weaknesses and gaps are globally. The problem is that the question, can we predict when this is going to happen, is way too complex for modern science. We don't understand. Why? Because we have, I can't even come up with the quantitative term. It's not trillions. It's trillions of trillions of exposures of different microbial agents all the time. You have the environment, which is constantly changing around that. You have human behavior, which is constantly moving and changing. And you have your own immune systems and how people react and expose in different ways. So all of these three factors are going around all the time. And one of the things that's driven me kind of crazy over the past few years is how many people try to poke holes at epidemiologists. And I say, look, you can't even tell me where the stock market is going to go. And that is dependent only on human behavior. You don't have to worry about a bunch of microbes or anything. That is just one piece. We're trying to map human behavior, microbial behavior, how that intersects with the environment, how you're immune. And so I think, so that's why those of us who work in public health and have worked in global public health and in other countries where I was building these systems in Africa and in Southeast Asia and East Asia, is we have to do this everywhere. And that includes the United States. And there really isn't a way around it. Now you can hedge your bets and put a little bit more money in certain areas. Pandemic influenza, we broadly think that arises in East Asia. But guess what? 2009 H1N1, as far as we know, it arose in central Mexico. So no matter where we put our bets, it doesn't mean that we might not be right. So,
Yeah, I also have thoughts on this, but I remember I'm speaking not as an epidemiologist, but just someone who has been humbled many times by the complexities around predictive power. I will echo a lot of the things you said. I think one thing worth really emphasizing is that people did see a big coronavirus-based outbreak coming. Like a lot of coronavirus experts have been screaming for years, like this is a big deal. Like this is a group of viruses that has enormous pandemic potential. And there is actually evidence that we've had coronavirus pandemics in our past, and that is how we got potentially one of our common cold coronaviruses around here today. People are paying big attention to flu viruses. Like we know some of the big families, but we also have not cataloged all the viral diversity out there. We have not cataloged all the potential reservoir species out there. Like in some ways, in all ways, models are only as good as the data we feed them, and we are still in a deficit in terms of the data that we are gathering, knowing that also the variables are changing all the time. So it's not like you go out and survey once and you're done. Like the proportion of species in a given area is going to be changing. The climate is changing. Human behavior is changing. The ways in which humans interact with species are changing. The proportion of land that is developed, the biodiversity is changing. Like this is so complicated. And so I think when people ask, why don't we know? It's like, well, we keep seeing the rough shapes, but if you are trying to peer through the noise, but someone's constantly shaking the camera and like the size of the beads is always changing, how are you going to see through it like constantly? This is something that requires enormous investment. There has been money put into it, but I would say not enough. There has been public interest in it, but I would say not enough. And this is something that I am constantly worried about. We've even seen just this year alone how many outbreaks are occurring all over the world with newer viruses, older viruses. The variables are always changing, and I think people just need to stop being surprised by this and try to do something about it, and ideally be proactive and less reactive, and that is ideally doing more data gathering, more surveillance, so that these models can improve over time.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest challenges I think that you'll face as journalists is communicating and selling the benefits of public health for the same reason that we inside and I use putting on my government hat, what it's like to be in government, which is prevention is incredibly difficult to prove, right? It is incredibly difficult to say this didn't happen because we did X. We can say it, we can show you statistics, we can predict models, but a lot of people just don't believe it, which is why we as a society, and I think broadly humans in general, favor cures over prevention, right? Because we see the person bleeding. I know that when I stick a Band-Aid on it, it's gonna stop bleeding, right? And visually it made sense. But to say that I prevented you from getting cut in the first place, how do I know for sure? How do I know that you weren't going to trip if I hadn't moved this away? So to the extent that you as journalists can think about telling stories about prevention, you'll actually be helping those of us in public health, because we're just not very good at that. Mostly because we are so heavily invested in the data, whereas, for most other fields, like look at the police, for example. When crime goes up, what do the police say? You're not funding us enough. When crime goes, or they say it's not our fault, like it's going up for others. And when crime goes down, oh, that's because we did a good job. So, in public health, we just have a very difficult time proving all that, and we kind of need help telling those stories better.
More public health stories. Okay. That helps me transition a little bit to a question I've had throughout the pandemic, which is the coronavirus pandemic, which is that as much coverage as we've had, the science and the public health advice had to change necessarily, because we were just learning about this virus. But we've still got a lot of people, a lot of the readers, viewers, consumers of media who I speak with, who still don't get some of the basics of how this virus transmits. And I wonder, is journalism just not done enough of communicating about this, or is it because the science has evolved so much, or is it something else that I'm missing? Or is it just that I'm over-immersed in it and I don't get that other people aren't consuming this information as much as I am? Do you have thoughts on that?
I have a big thought to start us off here, and I think, unfortunately, journalism and scientific experts can only do so much when science education is such a travesty in this country. It's deeply unfortunate, but I think people are not taught the basics of public health prevention, the basics of how their own bodies work, how microbes work, how things that they cannot see right in front of them work. I myself hated science until I got to college, because I thought it was about rote memorization of things that we already knew about the world. I didn't understand that even science was like a creative, interrogative endeavor until I got to college. And reflecting back on that makes me incredibly sad. I had to learn myself through a lot of mistake making that science was about storytelling and better understanding how I could interact with the world. And I think if more people were invited to take that perspective and more people were invited to ask questions instead of memorize answers, we would maybe have a little bit more of a dialogue at the very least early on. And people would maybe, I would hope, be less attracted to sound bites and be more interested in nuance.
Yeah, I give up when it comes to that. I don't know the answer. I mean, honestly, if you did a poll of I don't know, sort of a general population of the United States now on, what is the difference between a virus and a bacteria, and how does a vaccine work, would it be much better than it was pre-pandemic? I'm not entirely sure. I don't know. I mean, maybe a small incremental increase. But I do think that this sort of primary understanding of science is critical. But I think the greater challenge we all face is the one I think we're all very well aware of, which is, in this current moment right now, expertise is viewed as a part of the problem rather than part of the solution, right? There's this rising populist movements all over the world, misinformation, disinformation, it's all intended to sort of bring experts down from their perch. And that's incredibly challenging for those of us who work in these fields, because we also want to communicate uncertainty, right? We do our best. One of the things I always get trained in when I'm a student is to communicate what you know, what you don't know, what you're doing to find out. Information's going to change. We're not certain about this, but based on everything we know, this is our recommendation now, but it might change in the future. But when you're confronted by people who have no problem stating absolutes and spreading those messages wildly, then you get into these incredible battles. And you're seeing it in science as well, too, particularly on Twitter. You see all of these people who are realizing they can get huge followings and tons of money by being contrarians. And I'm really, really worried that science is turning into, at least in the United States, and I think this is happening in many other countries, into this, there's both sides to a story, let's tell both sides. I mean, are there both sides to gravity? I don't think so. I mean, but there seem to be great...
Gravity and air resistance.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, somebody has to stand up for the black holes of the world.
Sorry, that was...
But I don't know how you differentiate that. How you differentiate. I mean, this is a question for all of you, I guess. How you differentiate between I mean, I know what it's like, but in terms of from a telling it, fairly in a journalistic context, how you differentiate between legitimate scientific debates and uncertainty where people are coming to the problem, and in with a good integrity, versus those who are really doing this because they've got an axe to grind. And you've just seen that with COVID over and over again. People who really do know better saying the vaccines don't work at all, or the vaccines kill teen boys and stuff like that. They know there's nuance to this, but they're choosing not to do that. And that's I think a real problem for journalism and storytelling, because it does make a great story to say, look at this passionate debate, but it doesn't actually benefit the public.
Ivan?
Hi.
Ivan
I know this guy.
Ivan
Hey, Jay.
Orlansky, faculty
I'm
here.
about to embarrass you. So, Jay, we have known each other just a little while, and I'm going to quote you something, see if you can remember writing this. We may be students, but we are also journalists working for an independent corporation, training to do just what the Globe, meaning the Boston Globe, does. Always question, always analyze, and never accept anything less than the truth. So, Jay, I don't know if this is part of his bio, because I was downstairs checking vaccine cards, but this was his last column as the sports editor of the Harvard Crimson in 1993. And so I want to ask you, Jay, how did being sports editor of a college newspaper prepare you for being, I don't know if I want to say in charge of pandemic preparation, but working in government and elsewhere for pandemic? Because these are obviously journalism students, so you're kind of on the, if you will, other side of that. So talk to us.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so Ivan and I are Crimson colleagues from quite a long time ago. I loved sports. Honestly, this will date you how much. If I could have guaranteed that I would get a job as writing for Sports Illustrated, I would have probably just done that. Honestly, I loved Sports Illustrated. Not anymore. Obviously, now that would have been a bad career choice. But so I think actually I've always loved writing, and I think working on a newspaper. I mean, I was editor of my weekly newspaper in high school, and then obviously we used to publish 6 days a week on the Harvard Crimson. I loved it, and I think the things that I really liked about journalism training that I think have helped me tremendously are, number one, being learning how to communicate succinctly, cutting out all unnecessary words and getting it down to the because when you're writing for high-level executive people who have to make decisions, they don't need a 20-page memo. They want it in one page and in bullets and things. And so I think you learn that really well. Number two is I think you also learn the meaning of those words better. And so you learn how to lump and split in a way. It's a form of analytical thinking that you also learn in science and other fields. But I think there's a tremendous value in learning about that sort of communication power. And I think the third is I think you learn the power of storytelling and narratives. And I think a lot of us who go into medicine and public health, we get so obsessed with fact-based arguments that we forget the power of the anecdote, the power of the emotion in the story. And so I think that was one thing that I think I learned, writing, especially one of the things I loved about sports. I used to tell people who didn't like sports, why do you care about it? I think, because it's just an alternative world in which human drama is playing out. And it's just like people who love literature. It's just another field of drama. And if you think about it, a bunch of people chasing a ball, that's one thing, but it's actually much bigger than that in some ways. So anyway.
Yeah, it's soap opera, really. Katie, I want to get back to some of the work that you've done at The Atlantic on the pandemic. And one of the things I've noticed about your work, and this is not meant to embarrass you, just to praise you really, is that you had a knack for writing the story about the public health question that I had that day. How did you do that? How did you figure out, was it in conversation with editors, or was it just sort of like a process of writing down, what are my top questions today and how can I tackle this in a fresh way? Because you were ahead of the curve, and you continue to be in doing that kind of public service work, but also bringing narrative into it so that it's not just a bulleted list of, wear your mask, get your booster, and avoid large crowds.
Do you have an example?
I have an example. No, I will praise you. I will agree. I think you did a great job. I really do. I think you did an amazing job. I mean, there was many times that we were discussing debating issues, and I can't think of it. I remember we talked at one point about variants and other things like that, sequencing, I think reinfections, a whole range of things I remember that your writing, I thought, was really a nice, nuanced perspective on these stories, and I wished other people had said the same thing.
The one that's right in mind right now is the negative test. These negative tests are, your negative test doesn't mean what you think it means.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, like, I don't know how calculated it is, but I am just a very curious person. Anytime I wonder about something, whether it's COVID related or it's about like a marmot, I try to write it down because there's some reason, and if the question sticks in my brain and I can't immediately find an answer to it, like, I write it down. Like, those ideas come from everywhere. Or, I mean, this is another place where Twitter actually gets useful. If you notice people asking the same question over and over and over again, and especially if people are giving different answers, I'm always wondering, like, what's going on here? Is it that there's controversy? Is it that some people are wrong? Or is it that truly we don't know? And if this question is important and we don't know, what on earth is going on here? I pay attention to the questions that my friends and family are asking me because they have started to notice that I think a lot about COVID and monkeypox and polio, and they want to know, like, I don't have the answer for them, and when I don't, I tell them. But then sometimes that is the inspiration for a piece. I am also really grateful to my colleagues. We have Slack channels on Slack channels where, like, I think we literally have a channel titled Corona Q&A, and people are wondering about vaccines. They're wondering about, like, what is the best brand of antigen test to use, and like, what is going on? I've been coughing for 5 days and my antigen test is still negative. When am I out of the woods? When can I safely say, like, this is definitely not COVID, this is a flu, this is a common cold coronavirus? And I think that was actually part of the inspiration for that story. I mean, to be fair, I had reported a lot on testing before, especially for the Times, and so I was sort of already cued into this idea that this was like an ongoing question with test performance, especially as the variants were changing and human immunity was changing, but it was top of mind. So when people started asking that question, I sort of jumped on it.
Nice.
I mean, how much of that is because of your science background, I wonder?
Yeah, I mean, I have thought about this a lot. Like, I certainly missed out on going to journalism school or a program like this. I came to journalism from the science world, and there were a lot of things I had to unlearn. I don't think I am, in a different category of journalists by any means, but I do think there are a lot of things that are useful. I mean, I was trained as a scientist to, like, my job hinged on the availability of questions. And so I learned to pay attention to questions often more than answers. I got interested in things to which the current answer was, I don't know. Instead of just stopping there, I would ask, why? Or, like, how would you go about figuring that out if you had infinite resources? And sometimes that would be an interesting story. Or, like, we actually could answer this question right now if just 5 more people cared about it. That's a fascinating answer to me. And I think something that science journalists usually don't lean into enough is just questions of ambiguity or where the data is kind of thin or speculative. I think a lot of people get intimidated by that and don't want to report on it at all. But sometimes the public needs to hear about some of these stories where it is shaky, and not because they need a definitive answer from you as the reporter who's reporting on it, but because they need to hear that, oh, this is actively evolving, or like these 3 studies that form the basis of this entire field, they actually all kind of suck, and here's why, and here's how this research could be done better. I love questions like that. Like, I have written pieces where I've explained how PCR works because people started to care about that, and that makes a huge difference. Like, when people actually see how the sausage is made, if there are enough stakes, the better the dessert is at the end, the more broccoli people are willing to eat to sort of get there, I think. So, like, and the broccoli is the methods. That is the way that I think about it sometimes. So that is a way that I have taught at least a few people what cycle thresholds are in PCR.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'll just echo 2 things that you said, which I think are probably really important lessons, because I do think they represent kind of why you're so good at your job, which is number 1, which is ask your sources, how certain are you about this?
Yeah.
Like, how, are you really 100% certain? Like, where is the uncertainty around this? And that's where you're going to start to uncover, well, one, whether your source is actually a credible one, because they should hopefully say, well, we're pretty sure, but there's these questions, ideally. But that's where you're going to find some information, and that may be the meat of your story. And then second was the really powerful question you said, which is interestingly, I'll give you a little policy insight question, but the point you made was, if you had infinite resources, how would you answer this question? And to be honest, that is actually the way, and this is actually one of the ways in which I think a lot of public health people blew this, and I wrote an Atlantic, part of one of my Atlantic essays was about the sort of scarcity mindset, was that oftentimes people in public health are so used to having so little funding to do something, and they're always afraid that the money's gonna go away, or if they get $1 for this, it's gonna take away $1 from them. They rarely stop and say, okay, if I wanted to solve this problem, what would it take? Like literally just assume an unlimited budget and unlimited political commitment, what would it take? And then work your way down to actually what's feasible and acceptable. That's why I was giving you that kind of framework before. So, but the fact that you raise those two things, I think as a journalist is also the type of thing you should ask. How certain are you about this? And if you had unlimited resources, what would you do to answer this question? And I think you'll find some really great stories in there.
Both of you do a lot of science and health communication. There is something called fatigue around being constantly exposed to stories and news about COVID, and that will happen again. How do you push back against, or have you encountered this, maybe you haven't, but either of you, but an editor who says, I'm just tired of this, readers are tired of this, and you're like, no, wait, I have this story to tell, this is actually really important. And how do you know, you can ask them, I'm not even sure the fatigue is real, but I do encounter editors who say, no more coronavirus stories, thanks.
Well, I think I'm very lucky to work for a publication that has explicitly told me, like, we do want to encourage you to write about the things that you're obsessed with. This is the reason that I write often about cats. But like, if something feels really important to me, I will fight for it. I think knowing that a lot of, almost all outlets make their revenue based on how many people are clicking, how long people are spending on the page, like how much engagement readers have with articles, there is enormous pressure to sometimes meet readers where they are. And I think that can be problematic for the same reasons that attitude can sometimes be problematic in science or public health or public messaging. Like, if there is a general goal to not only inform the public, but push them to aspire to be better and to improve the status quo, it's not always gonna be telling readers what they want to hear. That's not saying that, like, I thrive on journalism that tells people, like, tisk, tisk, you're wrong. That's not gonna be the way to reach people. But I think making whatever story it is relatable, introducing concepts in a way that is going to make people want to stay in a piece and stay with you, whether it's finding sources that remind people of themselves, whether it's finding, I don't know, just a really, really, really powerful lead, surprising people even when they feel like they can no longer be surprised about something like the pandemic. I mean, there is no single answer to this, but it is a constant challenge, and it is exhausting. I get ridiculously sick of writing about the same things over and over myself, and I am also glad that I have editors who will alternately push me to keep going on a subject because they know how important it is for both our readers and also my development as a reporter, but are also willing to give me breaks and acknowledge that, like, actually, you know what, it is healthy for us to chill for a week and think about, how to sort of distribute our coverage. There are so many things going on, and there's always going to be another story that hasn't been told well enough. So,
yeah, I mean, I think I'm in a different perspective, obviously, because when I write, I'm mostly writing sort of commentary pieces. I think one of the challenges that I've had when, pitching to various editors, different places, is they don't really want to hear a wonky science debate. They want to hear, like, how can the layperson be engaged with this? Because I'm not reporting a story, I'm giving a commentary. So often there's lots of stories that I've wanted to kind of write about or controversies I think that people should know about because I think they're actually important and they can expose gaps in public health policy, but it can be more challenging to get into a lot of, I occasionally write for the ideas section, former Crimson colleague of ours is one of the editors that works with us on this. But yeah, I having to really, I use this term all the time. It's like, when is it a question for democracy and when is it a question for science? And so these questions for democracy are the ones that at least the big impact lay publications want. And I can get essays published that are more science-based in science-based journals, for example. I just wrote one about, polio for the British Medical Journal after the Times and the Atlantic and other people had turned it down. And I think it's an important story. And so today a New York Times reporter calls me about this story. I'm like, yeah, well, that's, tried to get it into your op-ed section, but now you're interested in it, but that's the type of challenge that I think I face, is trying to get editors and understand why these are interesting types of essays for a general audience. But I think it's different than reporting so much.
I hit that too, so. Go ahead, Delaney, please.
Hi, my name is Delaney. I'm a SHRP 40 graduate student. And first, Katherine, I wanted to congratulate you on your Schmidt Award for Excellence in Science Communication that
Very
you
cool.
received recently. And second, I wanted to ask if you think that, for all of us journalism grad students, if you think that people who want to be really impactful as early career journalists need other advanced degrees in the topics that they're covering. Say, if you want to cover public health, if you need to get a master's in public health, or something even more specific like microbiology.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I mean, I really think the answer is no. I think if you are willing to learn about a subject by talking to people, by taking online courses in your free time, just by reading a lot and just being willing to acknowledge the limits of your own expertise, like some of my most brilliant colleagues in journalism have no formal certified expertise in the subject matter that they cover. And that's actually really powerful in some ways, because they can often approach a subject from the viewpoint of their reader, who is also probably not going to have a PhD in virology or epidemiology or an MD or whatever it is. What is going to be most interesting to someone who has no background here? Can you find the stakes that is going to appeal to a non-expert and really go off of there? That's certainly not an excuse for not finding the right information to be able to translate it, but having that viewpoint and kind of approaching it from that angle can be really useful. I think one thing that actually bogs down my coverage sometimes, and that my editors will gladly confirm for you, is that I get too messed up in the details, the minutiae, and actually, no, you can cut these 19 graphs where you were writing about the nuances that no one cares about. If you have to raise a thing and then immediately destroy it, that whole thing can go. But that wouldn't fly as well in an academic paper. And so, I'm grateful for the path that I took, but it is by no means necessary.
Thank you.
Let's talk a little bit more about the power of storytelling. Katie, I think that you've done some pieces that have a lot of stories in them, that have a lot of patience in them. How do you, how's that different from stories that don't have patient stories in them?
Yeah, I mean, one big thing that jumps out at me immediately is those stories almost always take longer, and they almost always take way, way, way more out of me. I always feel like I have to be incredibly delicate when I am handling someone's personal information and when they are trusting me to tell a version of their story that feels true to them and also feels relevant to the broader story that I'm reporting at the time. Finding those people is not going to be as simple as going on Twitter and seeing who has a PhD, and people generally don't have PhDs in being a patient of X disease. It is just incredibly difficult to find those people, and you never want to look at someone and assume X, Y, or Z and be like, hey, I contacted you because you sure look like someone who could be a patient for my story. It is often really challenging, and when you have to report those stories, you have to think about privacy. Also, fact-checking gets incredibly difficult. It often goes as far as if this is a central part of your story, you may have to ask to see someone's private medical records to make sure that you're getting dates correct, specific numbers correct. You may have to speak with their physician. It gets very complicated very quickly. But I also think some of those stories are some of the most important ones that I've had the opportunity to report, because no one can speak to the experience of having a condition or a disease like someone who's actually been it. You can speak to it as an expert who has treated it, who has read about it in papers, who has looked at the cells experiencing it under a microscope, but that is absolutely not the same thing. And I think the most instructive and probably humbling thing that I've reported on that really speaks to that is long COVID, because this has been a brand new diagnosis, a diagnosis that is still evolving. It's not even one thing, as we are steadily learning every single day. And I think a lot of the world has moved on from worrying about it, unfortunately, but there are people who have been living with this almost since day one, and they are the ones pushing the research forward. So I continue to value those people as some of my most important sources. It is really difficult, and I think you need to pick up brand new skills in finding those people, handling their stories well, fact-checking those stories, obviously without violating your own journalistic integrity. And also, it hurts more when you have to cut those sources out of pieces, when you can't quote everyone. That's also something just worth grappling with emotionally when you're doing this from the journalist side.
Dr. Varma, when you're writing your commentary pieces, you don't have as much room for patient stories or narrative. Are there ways that you're able to work in the storytelling that I know you enjoy?
Yeah, no, I think it's much more challenging because from my perspective, because I'm trying to be the kind of like, trying to explain it from the perspective of the public health policymaker. I mean, that's sort of the angle that I like to take, because I just think that's not seen enough in most of the commentary that you read. There just aren't enough people with practical public health experience talking about these. I think that the power, though, I would just emphasize again the incredible power of this. As you probably already know, you're in journalism. But I mean, I use monkeypox as a perfect example. There were some journalists that got, well, first of all, there were some incredibly brave people who showed their vulnerability and acknowledged their disease on TikTok, on Instagram, and other places. But then there were those who spoke to journalists, and I will just say that those really made a huge difference, because I think the average kind of journalist covering this story, because I was fielding questions with them, well, it doesn't look like anybody's being hospitalized with this, and nobody's dying, and our hospitals aren't overrun. Why is this a big deal? And I would try to explain that people are suffering. But it wasn't until journalists were able to tell the stories and amplify the stories of, let's say men, because it was almost entirely men suffering from this, that I think it actually galvanized more elected officials to care about it, and particularly the White House and CDC. So I would think that this is really, really important overall, is to, I think that's the power that you can get as not sort of public health commentary people like me, but as actual on-the-ground reporters. Getting those stories is going to be so much more powerful than having a bunch of eggheads talk about what they think the right thing to do is. Yeah.
Go ahead, Dan.
Robin, I actually wanted to ask you something, and that is that you did something remarkable and very generous, I thought, during the pandemic, and that is that you put together a newsletter that came out pretty frequently, and it was incredibly useful for me, and I assume for lots of people, just to try to organize this massive flood of COVID-related coverage. And it was just very, like, your organized mind was on display, in an impressive and really useful way. But I often found myself asking, it's so great that she's doing this, but why is she doing it? Was that, what was sort of the inspiration behind that? And, I guess for Katie also, this idea of just constantly sort of cataloging other people's work can be useful in certain ways, but it doesn't really pay the bills. So why did you do it, and would you do it again, and was it a lot of work? Just tell them more about this thing that you did. And I don't know, Katie, if you've thought about doing that also. But go ahead, Robin, you first.
Oh, yeah. Just an aside, patient stories are exhausting. I don't know how you do it. Anyway, yeah, I always say with my investigative work, there's no perfect source. It's just like you're not going to find the best case story. Anyway, with the very corny short answer is love. The reason I did the newsletter was love. It's my family. My family was confused. They're educated people. A lot of them have higher degrees, and they were completely confused, and they're still completely confused. So that's part of why I'm asking the questions that I'm asking is like, how much public service should we be doing in our writing, and can journalism really accommodate the degree of education and transmission of public health information, basic public health information that our readers need and want. So my little audience of what grew to 2,000 people did really appreciate, and I still put out issues sometimes. They did appreciate the very concrete advice, sort of, that I was able to pull out, and I made sure not to make it my own advice and to constantly attribute stuff and constantly be careful about what went in there. There was a lot of curating and a lot of boiling down, and any time, you know, it was like a great exercise in journalism, because anytime I had any doubt, I was like, take it out. You know, if I'm not sure about that, forget it. Just tell them what we do know right now. And so that was it. It was just that my family was lost, and they still call me and are like, someone's coming to visit by train, and how safe is that? How can we make that safe? And I'm like, you can't. You know, my parents are, anyway. You know, there's a lot of seniors in my family, so I'm trying to take care of them, and I'm starting to wonder, like, can journalism do that? You know, I mean, have we done that? And I'm not fully satisfied with the answers to that. Katie, did... Sorry? The time. So initially, it only took me like a couple hours to do an issue, and I was doing it almost every day, so I didn't have to, you know, there wasn't as much information either, so in the first few months, it was pretty easy to do, but within, you know, in 2021, it started to take a lot more time, and I started to not have all that time. I needed to start doing something a little more lucrative, and the need diminished somewhat, but it's interesting, the need has not really gone away. I just have lost, I don't have enough time to do it anymore, but I'm trying to ramp it back up again when there is interesting news. And I'm missing material, like I was like, what? CDC is now recommending the bivalent booster for everyone over 5? I missed that news somehow, and I was like, I gotta tell all my readers about that. So there is still really important news that comes out, and I never get fatigued of it. That's part of why I get dismayed when editors are fatigued, or I don't know if it's something about my wiring, I guess. I was obsessed. But in a good way. I just really enjoyed doing the newsletter, and I just was really interested to find out what's the best advice that we have today that I can share with people who are really confused.
Before I know you're going to ask a question, but a question for you. What proportion of Americans is the wrong, let's pick a geographic area. Let's just say even New York City or something like that. What proportion of New York City adults, do we think get most of their news from reading it versus watching it on YouTube or Instagram? I'm curious about the channels. I mean, this is, I think, where some of the difficulty comes in with communication, right? Your audience is very learned and probably, or very, you know, very focused, as you said, a lot of seniors. They're used to an era when reading was the primary method, so they'll do that. But I know my kids, for example, they watch TikTok and YouTube. That's where they get their information. Even when I send them articles that I've written, they still not even sure they read them.
I think I was at Yankee Stadium recently, and what is the score right now, someone? So anyway, wait. Okay, great. And I was talking to someone, and some middle-aged person got all their news from YouTube, and I just was like, how do you do that? You know, because I just don't really have that skill, but I know that a lot of my former students and current students have that skill, and that I'm missing it. With newsletters, though, I think we have a lot of opportunities. Substack and the newsletter platform, I think we can reach. Yeah, there are still people who read, but there's something about that medium that is very engaging and a little more intimate. Podcasting also is a great medium, I think, that's very intimate, very accessible way to reach people. But Katie, I hear you inhaling. I think you have thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I'm going to actually attempt to address both points, because, Jay, I'm glad you brought that up. That was something that I was also thinking about. To answer the original question, I have actually never thought about writing a newsletter, and now that I am thinking about it, I think I won't. I'm tired. At the end of the day, I don't think I want to be writing any more, and I don't know, whenever I receive a question from like a family member or a friend that I don't have the immediate answer to, I will still try to find some other resource to point people to. So I don't think people necessarily need to read a ton more of what I have to say, but there are other things out there. But knowing that there is a very set audience that reads The Atlantic and is used to reading my work, and knowing that a lot of the people that I want to reach are outside of that, I am still thinking about many, many, many other forms of media that I can, get involved with to expand that audience. I never know who is going to be listening to the radio, or who might have CNN on in the background, or have Katie Couric's Instagram. I don't understand Instagram, so they're watching something on there. This is embarrassing. So when people ask me to go on TV or on the radio, I try to say yes, because again, these are people who may not be reading my work, but maybe there's a chance that they will still have, the opportunity to learn from me and the people that I have been talking to. And if there is an opportunity for me to do that, it also gives me practice at finding other ways to say things that I have written out long form, but I now have to condense into a 15-second soundbite. It's good practice for me, and I feel like it gives me the opportunity to play with different forms of communication. So I think no to the newsletter, but hopefully there are other things that I'm doing that are taking the place of that.
Yeah, Dr. Varma, you do tons, you did, I should say, a lot of broadcast interviews most recently that I'm aware of, and I'm sure you did plenty before. I was tuning into MSNBC every night, because for lack of anything better to do, perhaps. But, did you find that and you did talk earlier about your audience. Who do you see as your audience? You do the writing, but it does sound like you are multi-platform.
Yeah, I think I love the scientific communication aspect of the work. It's obviously, I just think it's intellectually really fun, and it's also an ego boost, right? Everybody likes getting somebody paying attention to you or talking or parroting what you said. There's other value to it, but I genuinely view it as like a really fun intellectual exercise. How do I take really complicated information and turn it into something people can use? Because so much of my life has been about public service, and I want people to change their behaviors or to advocate for certain things. And so I really like doing it, so I do a lot of local news stuff. I think there are a fair number of people that actually watch local news, so I often do some local news stuff when I'm asked to do it and things like that as well. But I was struck by something. One of the reasons I asked is, I can't even keep track of the number of media type interviews I've done from print and podcasts and radio and television in the past year, but it's in many triple digits or whatever. But one of the ones I got the most commentary on was they featured me on a small segment on the John Oliver show about monkeypox. And I got more comments from my social circle. I was like, but I've been on CNN, I was on Bloomberg TV, I was on a bunch of things in the past month, and that's what you notice? So it really is very ecosystem dependent, right? And what your demographic groups are and what you are. But I was just struck by wow, he gets a lot of audience among the people who are in my sort of social circle, which is very different than what other people might get, so.
Allison, did you have a question?
Hi, I wanted to ask a little bit, we talked a little bit earlier about risk and when you're trying to prove a negative about prevention and how that can be difficult. I've written a lot about antibiotic resistance, and something that I always find really difficult is to drive home the risk that we're talking about here, because oftentimes I'm talking about microbes circulating in the environment and environmental risk, where I guess I could find a patient story, but it doesn't really, the risk is more about any incremental amount of this in the environment can compound the problem and make it worse. And it's more of a statistical point almost. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how to talk about an emerging threat that is not something that you can point to hospitalization numbers as clearly as you can with something like COVID at this point.
Yeah, I might start just because, well, first of all, thank you very much for writing about that. Before I moved here in April of 2020, I was based in Africa at the African Union, and one of the things I was doing was leading this sort of continent-wide strategy for the African Union on antimicrobial resistance. And that problem in particular is one of the most difficult problems to cover because it's very similar to climate change. You're talking about a shared resource that all humans use, Antimicrobials are powerful and useful for all purposes, humans and animals and the environment. But when the consequences of them may take years to see what the impact will be, and the costs of doing something about it are borne by people who say, you're taking something away from me today to protect somebody in the future. So it's all very similar to climate change, and so therefore suffers from the exact same problem. It's seen as an abstraction to many people. And that's why I would try to, so a couple of things. So first of all, terminology is very important. I remember, again, right before I got here, I was at a meeting with the Wellcome Trust, which is very interested in this problem, and they did a whole research in English-speaking countries about what words work. And they tried to get everybody to get away from antimicrobial resistant and talk about drug-resistant infections. They thought that was a term that the average person heard better. But even that term, I think, is very hard for people to absorb. So I think the wording is really, really hard. So I think it needs better branding. That's number one. Number two is, I do think that talking about it, trying to tell human stories is critical. And that becomes very challenging, right? And so there is just talking about your problem in particular, there is like Stanford, there was a woman I used to work with from South Africa who had a horrible, skin grafting due to it. So she saw it as her own responsibility to go out and tell her stories. But we were trying when I was in Africa to find more human interest stories because you need that for that purpose. But so I would say try to find words that are easier for people to comprehend and market test them in some way. Do try your best to find patient stories. I think the third problem we have with climate change as a public service is the issue you raised before about outrage, right? Everybody's got a certain battery of outrage that's chargeable, right? And you can't charge it past 100% and it gets exhausted really quickly when you use it. So it's also very hard to generate interest in this. So I do think, picking your stories carefully to hit on certain things, whether it's why are there so many antibiotics used on farms, or why is it that, we can't use, if we just improved sanitation and vaccines, we'd prevent them. Picking kind of little pieces of the story rather than trying to tell the whole thing. At least those are my thoughts, but Katie, you may have better thoughts on this than me.
Well, I doubt I have better thoughts, but I have additional thoughts, and this is actually in part because my graduate school work was all on tuberculosis, so I have a lot of feelings about antimicrobial resistance. I think another challenge, and the climate change analogy is very apt, but there's another thing that antimicrobial resistance really reminds me of, and it is, I think, the problem we have with epidemic obesity. We cannot go cold turkey on antimicrobials. We have to use them less. We have to use them judiciously. Like, the people who are experts in this often talk about, stewardship, like really being careful about when and where they are deployed, like not doing this willy-nilly. But like the solution is never like throw them all into the throw them all into the sea would create all sorts of additional problems. But like it's not like stop.
We do actually, unfortunately,
Right,
that's a whole
I
other
know.
issue. But yes.
But like this is something that we are incredibly reliant on, and it's not like they're universally bad. It's not like they're universally good, and people can't handle that spectrum. And like that's not to belittle the intelligence of the public, but it's a very difficult message to convey when we're operating entirely in that spectrum of gray. And it's not like we can say like give 5 doses to the cows and we're going to be set. Like it's really complicated. It's so context dependent, and those stories are incredibly difficult to tell. I will say that there is still a role for patient stories. Like there are certainly people who have died because they have contracted a strain of something that was resistant to all available drugs. And like I actually know someone personally who died because of that, because she had cystic fibrosis. And it was a really tragic story. Those stories do have a role, and they are not often told. They can also be really challenging stories to get. But there are also, I think this is where history and incorporating historical anecdotes into your reporting can really be your friend. We have seen sort of the biodiversity impacts of antimicrobial resistance having these like ripple effects across food webs and affecting entire populations of people, affecting entire species of animals. And like, even if it is not something that is, I don't know, something that happened yesterday, like just showing that this actually altered the course of history, this really changed how we think about, I don't know, gonorrhea in context X, Y, or Z, that can be impactful. Like these are things that people so often forget about. They take for granted the power of some of the drugs that we have in use today. But I think people are starting to think about this with like COVID, with SARS-CoV-2, and they're not realizing that this is a problem that we have been dealing with for a very, very long time. just some loose thoughts to throw in there. So definitely there are concrete examples to use, even if there's not perfect relevance thematically, just reminding people that this can really alter a population's strategies for a big problem.
Was there another question?
Hello everyone, it's me Sogat. I'm a freelance science journalist. So since we are talking a lot about Twitter, so I just pulled this question from, I think Dr. Varma has just posted this tweet, I think 3 hours back. He said like, in the last 7 months, percentage of adult New York City residents receiving additional COVID-19 vaccine dose has just increased by only 3.3%, putting it up to like 47.6% altogether, I think. So what do you think, like who is failing here? Like we as a science communicator, or society is like made this way, or like government, or who is at fault here?
Yeah, I mean, so the big picture for those of us who work in public health is there's a basic principle, which is that the health of any community is purchasable. Like, if you as a society choose health as your highest priority, you can actually buy longevity if you want to. It is actually pretty well known. Now, there's certain limits to human life, but you can largely do it. And I start with that abstract concept to get to the point is that if we actually want, and getting sort of the paradigm I was saying before about ask this question of your, like, what would it take to get 100% vaccine rates if you actually really wanted to do it? It would take fairly draconian measures. And you're looking at the draconian guy who was telling the mayor from January of 2021, you're gonna need a vaccine mandate. I'm just telling you right now. And he's like, oh, no, we can wait. And I was like, no, you're not, just let's start planning this because it's gonna happen. So the reality is that we as a US have failed at every level of this because, and we failed in the way that I think is the worst possible way, which is that we are really good at generating commodities and we're really bad at delivering them, okay? So we know the US generates the most knowledge about most infectious disease problems, the most commodities to deal with them, drugs, vaccines, treatments, whatever it is, but does some of the worst job at actually delivering them to people. So if you wanted to get your vaccination levels up higher, you would do a whole range of things, right? You would have a universal healthcare system, and you would be sending messages to everybody that goes to their doctor every single time about getting vaccinated. You would have much broader vaccine requirements and mandates, and you would have incredible investment in direct community outreach. The same amount of intensive effort it takes to mobilize people to vote, where you literally have to knock on doors and have small community meetings of 10 or 20 people. That's how you get from, let's say, 80% vaccination to 85% or 90%. So all those incremental things, but they cost a lot of money and political will. And people have lost that in the United States.
We'll also add paid sick leave to that list. But yeah, I mean, a couple thoughts to add to that, and I realize that was probably a question directly for Jay, but I have a lot of feelings about vaccine uptake. I mean, it's really interesting to sort of look at attitudes to vaccination in this country, because we are a country that very much prioritizes, that these are themes that have come up already, but reacting instead of being proactive. What is a vaccine best at doing? It's being preventive. It's making sure that someone takes it before the surge comes, bolstering a population's defenses before the virus mounts its offense. It's just not something that people think of very regularly. I mean, look at flu vaccine uptake in this country. This is not a new problem. And I think that speaks to two general, I think, cultural and maybe infrastructural things that the US would do well to invest a little bit more in. One is like an essential part of, I think, just pandemic preparedness and maybe crisis preparedness in general is more investment in behavioral science, social sciences research. How, like, we just talked about like this, the idea of the disease triangle, right? Like a disease is only gonna happen if the host is there, the pathogen is there, and the environment is right. We think a lot about the pathogen, but like human behavior is this whole sector that has, I think, repeatedly surprised us during the pandemic, and I sort of wonder, like, why are we so often surprised by that? Should we really, really, really just be more careful to pay attention to the attitudes that people have and how that is going to affect what people are going to do, what is going to turn a vaccine into a vaccination? That is all from the behavioral side, the psychological side, the sociological side, the equity side. And also just as a cultural phenomenon. We are very, very, very much prioritized on individual behaviors rather than collective behaviors. We see better vaccine uptake in countries that have a more collective mindset, and that messaging is often easier. Just, I think, something to think about. I don't think there are silver bullet solutions to this, but it's going to be, I think, a really rough road ahead in future outbreaks if we don't address those concerns.
One other point I would just make that I should have made before is just to acknowledge also how difficult this problem is, despite my sort of criticism of the U.S. Getting high levels of adult vaccination is incredibly difficult. That's why nowhere in the world do you have large-scale adult vaccination programs. You have vaccine programs that target young children because they go to medical appointments, they need to enter school and things. So one of the things that's most depressing to me about sort of the COVID pandemic is this anti-vaccine sentiment and this backlash against childhood vaccination, because the only way that we're gonna prevent COVID from devastating generations of Americans, let's say to keep ourselves parochial and focus on Americans, is to be vaccinating children, because that's what you need to do. Instead of getting them repeatedly infected, vaccinate them, and then over time, then you'll build up population level immunity. It's very difficult to do it for any adult.
So as we get close to time, is there one more question?
Yeah.
Please.
Hi, thanks so much for being here and for both of your work during the pandemic. I just had a question. I mean, a lot of us were early career journalists, and we know that journalism is a pretty intense profession usually, and then being in the middle of a pandemic, you've both produced so much work these last couple of years, and I'm just curious how you combat personal burnout, and if you have any tips for how to take care of yourself and the importance of establishing healthy habits early on as well.
It's a great question and something that I am still figuring out every single day. But it's a really important one to be asking, so, kudos for asking it. I don't know if I'm great at it yet. I work a lot and it is very stressful. I think I have tried to establish boundaries for myself, which is especially difficult when you are working from home and your office is also your guest bedroom, which is the case for me. And it's also very difficult to be working, maybe not work, reporting on a pandemic and then stopping work and realizing you are living in that same pandemic. There is kind of no respite from it. I am really grateful to have a wonderful personal support network, friends, family, cats, amazing coworkers who encourage me to take time off. Like my editors have said, stop working, go home. And I have learned to listen to them because they know what is good for me. I have also, even within work, I have tried to learn to take breaks, writing on things that have nothing to do with infectious disease, writing science stories that make me laugh and hopefully make my readers laugh. Reminding myself that not every story has to have the biggest stakes in the entire world to get readers, and that people can just be curious about something and want to see something delightful or something that they will pull out at their next party as an interesting fact. That's part of the reason I got into this in the first place, and just reminding myself of that. I think also just logging out of Twitter often helps immensely. Twitter, as useful as it can be, it is also a sort of toxic and soul-sucking place. Just knowing what makes you feel stressed and noting those things, not only introducing the things that make you feel better, but removing the things that make you feel worse. I've often thought about if you are making a choice between two different jobs or something, it's not just about what is pulling you toward the jobs, but also what's pushing you away from the different jobs. It's very similar in terms of work-life balance and how to sort of navigate, how am I going to spend the next hour or 2 hours of my time?
Yeah, don't read the comments for anything. I can't say I'm very good at that, but I try. I've been times when when my wife or kids was I was like, oh, did you see their comments? I was like, no, don't tell me. I'm not going to read them. But more importantly, that is actually a serious point, I think, for most of us. But a couple of things just off the top of my head. Choose work that's meaningful to you. I mean, if you're going to get burned out on anything, at least make it be something that you find meaningful, right? Don't get burned out like being the personal assistant to some hedge fund manager. Sorry if anybody's going to do that now. Get burned out writing stories that are meaningful about patients and that suck your soul because they're so important. So if you are going to get burned out, at least you're doing it in the service of something. So that's one sort of important point. And that's the way it felt like for me for about a year and a half. Like, this was really hard, but you know what? I felt like I trained my entire life for this. And I felt like this is one thing I'm actually good at doing. And so I want to do this because there's other things I can't do. And this I can do. Number one. Number two is really lean into personal relationships. I think this was probably the biggest problem with the pandemic and challenge, is that all the things that could give you joy, hugging your friends, being in a group where everybody's feeling joy together, we lost that. And so I would really, really emphasize how important it is to have friendships, romantic partners, whatever it is, animal friends, whatever it is that gives you contact and joy, physical touch and stuff. I think it's just insanely and incredibly important. I think that's really powerful. And I would say the third is, constantly asking yourself at different times, like, is this what I really want to be doing? Is this meaningful to me? And again, it doesn't mean that everything has to have meaning, because just think over the long term. Sometimes things are just really hard and they're not fun, right? But they're getting you to a point that you want to be somewhere. But checking in from time to time, but also recognizing the fact that it may be really hard now, but there's a reason you're doing it, or recognizing it's really hard and it's not getting me where I want to go, so I need to get out. Trying to learn the difference in those things. So those would be some of my thoughts.
Dan, I don't know if you want me to keep going because we're over time, but I do have one more question I could issue if you're interested. It's a closing question, so I will ask. We've talked a little bit about some of the shortcomings and some solutions, but I do like thinking about solutions. So really the answer to how do we stop failing at covering the next pandemic, or how can we do better, maybe is a more positive spin on it, is, as science journalists and health journalists, covering the next pandemic, the next outbreak, whatever it is, and continuing with COVID. What are our best practices? What can we take away from this conversation? And some of what I heard was, we do need to keep educating our readers. That's a big issue. Public education perhaps isn't doing everything that it could, and that's something that, I do embrace that as part of my role. I've heard diversify sources. Don't just go to, the elite institutions, the elite academic sources that our minds are, it's the easiest place to go, and we do hammer that in our education of science journalists, but there's more to it than that. Sometimes we forget that. I think Katie was really good at explaining ways to get other kinds of sources in your stories that enrich your stories. They don't detract. And telling stories, engaging, keeping the storytelling in your pieces as much as you can, even when it's commentary. Try to find a way to squeeze in an anecdote. And Katie, you talked about historical anecdotes. I thought that was very good. Sometimes you don't have a personal anecdote, but you can use a lesson, a turning point in history to bring in. Are there other takeaways that we can talk about for best practices, best approaches, how we can do better, or don't do this as we did during COVID in the last 2.5 years?
Yeah, two things came to mind. I think one is embracing a little bit more of two things that have often been cast as taboo in both journalism and academic science: I don't know and negative data. Both have, I think, enormous roles to play when we're figuring out like a totally new situation, a new crisis, and we know that like advice and understanding is going to keep evolving. If people have an enormous question, and there isn't a clear-cut answer, sometimes you do need to walk straight into that uncertainty and just be upfront with readers. Certainly not with the goal to frustrate them or say like, we're aghast that experts don't know the answer to this yet, but just like, this is, we're figuring this out. Here is the best that we have right now. Keep in mind that this is going to change because this is how it works. It's a difficult story to tell, and it's a difficult story to keep telling, I think. And you're going to be wrong sometimes when you report something that is evolving and understanding, but it's an important skill, I think, to pick up and just continue to weave into future coverage, even where there is going to be more certainty about something. The other thing is, I think, really collaborating across journalistic disciplines, knowing that science is so often going to intersect with culture, with politics, sports even. Like, turn to your colleagues if you have the fortune of working somewhere where there are people who have done different kinds of journalism. Data journalism is becoming such an important thing, like visualizing concepts, just really benefiting from how your colleagues have learned to tell stories and find sources and find fresh angles on things. I am so often humbled by that, and like really, really benefit from just reading my colleagues' work across disciplines. It's so siloed in both academic science and science journalism that I think we could do better to learn from the people who are sitting right next to us.
Some final words, Dr. Varma?
Yeah,
Advice?
I mean, just two thoughts. I mean, I think you both of you, I think, covered all the key points. One, I just wanted to amplify one that you made, which is the importance of societal factors, as I pointed out before, politics, culture, race, economics in health. I just think it's underappreciated, and not just health problems, but health policy and how those factors play into it. So being upfront about and proactive about asking, okay, I'm writing a science story, but I want to know, why is this culturally? Why do we care about this? Or politically, try to probe into that. I would just sort of amplify that, because I do just think that's really so important. And it's essential to public health. It's one of the reasons I love public health. I love public health because I don't just like science. I like learning from people I don't know anything about. I like working with veterinarians and anthropologists and policymaker, So that multidisciplinary, if you can bring that flavor to your stories, I think that's going to be really powerful. And then I think the last point I'll make just with closing is I just want to thank all of you for actually going into this field. Like it is, I'm serious. I mean, I'm sure it's going to be hard to be on the job market. And think, as the pandemic becomes less important to people, I can't guarantee there's a job out there for you. But
There is a job out there.
But seriously,
It's a good job market.
the work you do is so important. I mean, it's amazing. Like, I've lived and worked all over the world, and one of the things that is missing in most places of the world are people to be aware of how much they are robbed of health because of bad public policies or lack of investment in certain areas, or because of commercial interests that don't get attention. And why is it that people don't get angry about that? Because nobody's telling their story, okay? And as science journalists, you are uniquely positioned to be able to tell stories for people who may not be aware of the issues that are going on. Think about the crisis we have just in the United States on local journalism, right? Think about any health stories that could be told about whether it's pollution or under-vaccination or anything that could be told in local areas. So, I mean, I want to say that throughout my career, I've been asked really difficult questions and dealt with many difficult reporters, but you know what? That was good for society, right? It was good that when I was in government, somebody was calling me out and because they do make us think. And I will tell you from the inside, everybody cares about what's being written. Every day, those news clips are getting circulated through City Hall, and I have to be prepared to answer for why they came out a certain way. So people care about what you do, and because people in power care about what you do, you're doing something important.
Wow. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and experience.